The Pacific, June 20th, 1944. 7:45 in the evening. The sun went down about an hour ago, and there isn't a single visible star over the water, just low cloud and black all the way to the horizon. In the cockpit of a Hellcat fighter, a pilot checks his fuel gauge again. The needle passed 0 a while ago. Exactly how long ago, he's trying not to think about. He can't see his own hands on the stick, only the dim glow of the instrument panel and the darkness ahead, where, by the squadron navigator's dead reckoning, a carrier should be. The radio comes alive. Not one voice, but dozens at once, talking over each other. Pilots across the whole strike group are reporting the same thing. No fuel, no landmarks, no lights. Below him there's no coastline, no island, nothing for the eye to fix on, just a few thousand feet of warm, dark water, where the only difference between sea and sky is that the sea will kill him in minutes instead of hours. Within the next few minutes, more than 200 aircraft, just like his, will be hanging over an empty black ocean with no idea which way home is. And almost every one of them is up there because of a decision made a few hours earlier by a man who understood exactly what it would cost. The day before had gone very differently for these same pilots. On June 19th, the U.S. Navy's fast carrier force, Task Force 58, spent the entire day grinding down Japan's carrier air power over the Marianas. American radar picked up incoming Japanese formations 45 to 60 miles out, giving fighter directors enough warning to scramble interceptors and meet them well before they reached the fleet. By the summer of 1944, Japan had lost almost all of its experienced pilots, burned through at Midway and in the Solomons, and the replacements coming up now had only a handful of flight hours against Americans who'd spent 2 years refining exactly this kind of fight. Of more than 370 Japanese carrier planes launched that day, roughly 350 were shot down. American air-to-air losses came to fewer than 10 aircraft. One moment from that morning would become a legend before nightfall. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, flying off the carrier Lexington, dove into a formation of Japanese dive bombers and shot down 6 of them in 8 minutes, using 360 rounds of ammunition. When he came back aboard, he held up 6 fingers out of the cockpit before the engine had even stopped turning. The Japanese flagship, meanwhile, was already doomed that same morning. Not from the air, but from below. Around 8:15, the American submarine Albacora put a torpedo into the brand new carrier Taiho, Vice Admiral Ozawa's flagship. Fumes from ruptured fuel lines spread through the ship, and about 6 hours later, Taiho was torn apart by an internal explosion. Ozawa had to shift his flag to a cruiser and watch his own carrier go down before the air battle over his fleet had even finished. That same day, a second submarine, Kavala, put 3 torpedoes into the carrier Shokaku, one of the 6 that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor. A few hours later, her bomb magazines went up, and Shokaku took 1,272 men down with her. By the evening of June 19th, Ozawa had lost hundreds of aircraft in the sky and 2 of his 6 carriers, including his own flagship. And the day's air battle hadn't even reached the American fleet yet. Later, the day would get a simple nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But a turkey shoot is easy killing, taken without risk to the shooter. The night of June 20th into the 21st would turn out to be about something else entirely. What victory actually costs, when the bill isn't paid in enemy bombs, but in the distance back to the ship. Overall command of the operation belonged to Admiral Raymond Spruance, and by the next day, his decisions had already become the subject of an argument that hasn't fully died down even now. Rather than throw the whole force into pursuit of the retreating, already battered Japanese fleet, Spruance chose to keep his priority on covering the landings at Saipan. The Operation Task Force 58 had come to these waters to protect in the first place. Some called it caution unbecoming of a winner. Others called it exactly the judgment a commander is supposed to have, remembering that his job wasn't to chase trophies, but to make sure the Marines ashore didn't lose their air cover. But that restraint let the Japanese fleet pull far enough away that American scouts didn't relocate it until late the following afternoon, and that delay is what would put Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, commanding the carrier force inside Spruance's fleet, in front of a decision with no safe option at all. Mitscher was 57, practically an old man by the standards of carrier aviation. A flyer from an era when a shipboard airplane was still a novelty for the brass to watch, not a weapon. He was Naval Aviator No. 33, a designation he'd earned on June 2, 1916, a full year before America even entered the First World War. By 1944, he no longer flew himself, but he still wore his trademark long-billed cap, not for style, but because the tropical sun burned his face raw within minutes, and that's exactly how he once explained it, plainly no embellishment. He had commanded the carrier Hornet, from whose deck Doolittle's bombers launched for Tokyo back in April of '42. He'd been aboard Hornet at Midway too, in the battle where his own air group flew past the Japanese fleet at the decisive moment and never found it. A mistake that never got him relieved, but that he clearly never let himself forget. Mitscher knew the cost of a missed search better than almost anyone on this bridge. And he was also the admiral his pilots would keep describing the same way for years afterward. A man who never forgot what it felt like to sit alone in a cockpit over empty ocean, and who did whatever it took to bring downed crews home, even when it meant risking his ships to do it. All through the day of June 20th, Mitscher is waiting for one report, where Ozawa's fleet is. After the previous day's beating, the Japanese have pulled west, and through the morning and into the afternoon, search planes find nothing. The hours tick by, and daylight ticks away with them. Daylight he needs not just to find the enemy, but to bring his own strike home safely afterward. All day, the same tension sits on every bridge in the task force. The later the target is found, the shorter the window to hit it and still get home before dark. By mid-afternoon, that window is nearly closed. There's still no report. Then, around 4 o'clock, word finally comes in. Contact. Range, roughly 230 nautical miles. For carrier aircraft of that era, that's close to the outer edge of what a plane can fly out and still fly back on, and it isn't the kind of edge you can round off to close enough. If the strike goes out at this range, it's coming home in the dark, on fuel tanks with no margin left for a mistake, and no margin for circling the deck and extra time waiting for a landing slot. Mitscher is facing a choice with no safe branch. Hold back now, and he loses the only chance to reach the Japanese carriers before the light is gone entirely, and repeats Midway, only this time not because of bad scouting, but because of his own caution. Strike now, and he sends hundreds of his own pilots, including Alex Vraciu, back up in the air again as fighter escort, on a 4-hour round trip over open ocean, already knowing that almost all of them will be finding their way home without daylight and without much fuel to spare. He orders the launch. Time 16:21. 216 aircraft, Helldivers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and their fighter escort head west, straight into a setting sun that's about to become nothing but an obstacle on the way back. They catch Ozawa at the very limit of their range. The Japanese have only about 75 fighters left to cover the fleet, against the entire strike wave of Task Force 58. The fight is short and brutal. The carrier High takes a torpedo hit and several bomb hits, and a few hours later rolls over and sinks, taking roughly 250 men down with her. 2 Japanese fleet oilers, Genimaru and Seimaru, go down as well, taking with them what little fuel the Japanese Navy had left to give. The carriers Zuikaku and Juni are damaged, along with the light carrier Chiyoda and the battleship Haruna. By that evening, of the 430 Japanese planes launched across the 2 days of fighting, only about 35 are still airworthy. A navy that had gone into the morning of June 19th, hoping to turn the whole Pacific War in a single battle, ends the day of June 20th with its carrier air power effectively erased. No matter how many hulls it technically still has afloat. This is a victory. And in the same minute, the last bomb hits Hiyo's deck, an entirely different fight is starting for 202 American aircrews, one against the dark and against their own fuel gauges. The sun goes down while they're still flying home. Pilots who an hour earlier were bombing an enemy fleet with the precision of a training range are now just searching the blackness for a single light and finding none. Because the whole of Task Force 58 is running under strict blackout discipline, exactly as wartime doctrine requires. No running lights, no searchlights, nothing that could give away the fleet's position to a Japanese submarine that could easily be sitting in these exact waters right now. The radio dissolves into a chaos of hundreds of voices reporting the same thing. No fuel, no bearings. Some are already ditching blind, unable to see even their own wingtips. Others circle over the spot where, by dead reckoning, a carrier should be, and there's nothing there. On the ships, navigators are frantically recalculating course and drift, knowing that the accuracy of their math right now isn't an abstract number on a report. It's a specific man who'll have nothing to breathe underwater in 20 minutes if they get it wrong. On the bridge of the flagship Lexington, the same carrier Vraciu had flown from that morning with 6 kills to his name, Vice Admiral Mitscher stands listening to this. His staff understands exactly what's at stake. Lighting up the fleet turns every ship in the task force into a perfect target for a periscope that could be sitting at attack range right now. Just as invisible in the dark as the fleet's own aircraft are. Blackout doctrine forbids it, no exceptions. The whole rule exists for a night exactly like this one. The decision Mitscher has to make in the space of a few minutes breaks the entire logic of blackout discipline he's operated under for the whole war. Light up the fleet. The order goes out to every ship. The Admiral's exact wording that night has never been definitively pinned down by historians. Different accounts render it differently. Everything from a blunt turn on the lights to detailed instructions sent ship by ship. But the fact of the order and its scale isn't in dispute. Within minutes, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers across Task Force 58 light up all at once in the middle of a black ocean, searchlights stabbing straight up into the sky, deck lights burning the way they haven't burned once since the war began. One of the returning pilots would later describe what he saw from the air in 2 words, like a big city at night. Another compared it to Coney Island on the 4th of July, mid-fireworks. A fleet that had spent the entire war learning to be invisible now gives itself away for its own aircrews. It doesn't fix everything at once. On every carrier's deck, the landing signal officer, the man who on an ordinary night works by a handful of carefully controlled lights, suddenly finds himself on a brightly lit platform the size of a football field, with a stream of aircraft coming in not from his own orderly rotation, but from several squadrons at once, some of which are seeing this particular deck for the very first time. Somebody's coming in too fast, somebody's too low, somebody has no working flaps at all, and the landing officer has 2 or 3 seconds at most to wave them off or bring them down, working half blind in a light that dazzles almost as much as it saves. Plenty of pilots mistake one ship for another in the dark, aiming for the first lit deck they can find, some even lining up on destroyers which have no flight deck to land on at all. Only in the first few minutes of recovery, 18 aircraft crash right on the flight decks, landing gear collapsed or shot away, no altitude left for a second try. Lieutenant Ronald Ripgift, coming back from the strike on the Japanese fleet, ends up putting his plane down not on his own carrier, but on the light carrier Monterey, simply because it's the first lit deck he finds in the dark. He's lucky he still has altitude and control when he finds it. A lot of others don't have either. All of this is happening not on one ship, but on more than a dozen at once. Across the whole spread of the task force, 7 carriers, battleships, and escorting cruisers are lit up simultaneously, each one running its own separate stream of aircraft trying to land, with no coordination between decks. For a few minutes, the sky over this stretch of ocean turns into something between a rush-hour airport and a battlefield, where almost nobody can tell their own formation from anyone else's. Of the 202 aircraft trying to find their way home in the dark, 122 manage to land on some deck. 80 don't make it. They either ditch or crash trying to land. By nightfall, the sea around Task Force 58 is scattered with life rafts and men in life jackets spread out over dozens of miles. Escort destroyers immediately shift into rescue formation and spend the whole night creeping along at low speed with searchlights, pulling crew after crew out of the water. That first night alone, 143 of the 185 men down in the water are recovered. The next day, seaplanes join the search, combing the area for several more days, not randomly, but working set grid squares, plotted from positions ditched crews had radioed in before they went down. The search continues not because anyone's counting on a miracle, but because an unspoken rule has already taken hold across Task Force 58. As long as there's any chance a man is still afloat, nobody calls it off to save fuel or time. One of these rescues doesn't come from a ship at all, but from a submarine. The American sub Sea Wolf, on the surface nearby specifically for cases like this, pulls aboard Lieutenant Albert Walraven and his radio man gunner, John Bramer Jr., 2 men who, in the dark, are found not from the air but from below the surface, because a submarine can spot a lit life jacket on the water closer than a plane can from altitude. There's a quiet symmetry in it. A day earlier, it was submarines, Albacore and Kavala, that sent 2 Japanese carriers to the bottom and decided the outcome of the whole battle before a single flight deck had even fired a shot. Now a submarine from the same navy is pulling out of the water the men that navy nearly lost to the cost of its own victory. The final count for that night: 16 pilots and several dozen aircrew. Sources disagree, putting the number anywhere between 22 and 33, never made it home. The rest, more than 150 men whose planes never reached a deck, were pulled from the water alive over the following hours and days. Vraciu, who'd shot down 6 planes in 8 minutes that same morning and then flown escort again that evening, would survive the war as one of the Navy's top aces, but it wasn't this night, over this stretch of ocean, that would decide how he'd be remembered. That December, he'd be shot down again, this time over the Philippines, and would spend the next several months not in a cockpit, but among Filipino guerrillas, working his way through the jungle back toward American lines. A man who, on one June morning, downed 6 aircraft in 8 minutes. And who, half a year later, would owe his life not to his own skill as a pilot, but to strangers on the ground who decided to hide him. Mitscher got both praise and criticism for June 20th. The same way Spruance got criticism for not throwing the fleet into pursuit the moment the 19th ended. Some called the order to light the fleet a textbook example of a commander putting his pilots' lives above the letter of doctrine. Others said, flatly, that if the strike had gone out a couple of hours earlier, and it could have, if Spruance had pushed pursuit from the start, there would have been no night to survive in the first place, and the order to light the fleet was just a fix for a problem that never needed to happen. Both sides are probably right at once, and that's exactly why this night is remembered better than the Turkey shoot itself, the day before. Because June 19th was won by hardware, radar, speed, pilot training in a straightforward daytime air battle. The night of the 20th into the 21st was won by one aging man's judgment call on a bridge, made with no time to check the manual or wait for permission from above. No Navy regulation was ever formally rewritten because of June 20th. The risk of submarine attack the moment those lights came on was completely real, but that particular night, no Japanese submarine happened to be in position to take the shot. And that was luck, not a guarantee Mitscher had any right to count on when he gave the order. What he got in return for the risk wasn't a new line in a manual. It was a reputation that outlived him. For the rest of the war, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, his pilots knew that if it ever came down to a choice between doctrine and a man still alive in a cockpit, their admiral would choose the man. Task Force 58 fought on for another year and a half after that night. The Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And Mitscher commanded it the same way straight through to the end, far readier to risk his ships for his aviators than his aviators for his ships. He never again had to make a call quite that size, because after that night, no operation went out on the edge of its range into failing light without genuine necessity forcing it. What happened on June 20th never made it into a manual, but it stayed in the back of every staff officer's mind, calculating the fuel margin on every strike that went out for the rest of the war. The pilot in that Hellcat, the one whose fuel needle had long since passed zero, would eventually see something on the horizon that wasn't stars and wasn't a coastline. It was light, artificial, far too bright, far more dangerous than anything he'd been trained to trust back in flight school. And he turned straight into it, because on that particular night, it was the only light on the entire black ocean.